Let's talk the true crime documentary Quiet on Set, the dark side of kids' TV. This is going to be a little bit different than maybe my typical reviews, and I'm more just going to be talking to the camera. I don't have anything really planned. I don't really know what criticism I'm going to talk about in this. I can't review this in any way that's going to be compelling or even helpful. And this is a rough thing and documentary for me to talk about, obviously, as a kid of the 90s who grew up watching a lot of the shows on Nickelodeon, such as Zoe 101, such as The Amanda Show, such as Drake and Bell, all of those shows that were run by Dan Schneider, who this documentary alleges did really horrible stuff on set, and a lot of his cronies did really terrible stuff on set. Again, this is all allegations that have been thrown at Dan Schneider. There is some that seem to be more easily proven than others. There's some that just due to legal cases and NDAs, it's always hard to actually pinpoint anything in cases like this. So I just wanted to kind of talk about this documentary and my watching of this. And in saying this, I guess I should just kind of give some context. Obviously, I'm born in the year 1998. I'm 26 years old, which means these shows were on during my what, like early, like 8 to 12 years old is probably the sweet spot for Nickelodeon, or Teen Nick, I think as it was called for me. So, I mean, at that time, it was Drake and Josh. It was The Amanda Show. It was Zoe 101. It was a show with Emma Roberts. Oh, God, what was the name of that show? It's Ned's Declassified. There was a lot of these. iCarly was kind of after my generation. I think I watched like the first season or two of that. But there was Nickelodeon was a big part of my childhood, and these shows and some of these actors that are in there are pretty fundamental big parts of growing up. So hearing, and specifically hearing Drake Bell talk about it, was a really harrowing experience. And also, I should just kind of note, I've been working in, let's just call it working adjacent to film journalism for a few years. I've been a film critic now for like 3 years. Never really worked on the investigation side of film journalism or anything like that. However, I've worked close enough in tangent and have followed Hollywood enough that I was, at the very least, fairly familiar with the rumors and allegations that were kind of under the shadow about Dan Schneider and some of the alleged abuse that occurred on his sets. So it's not like watching this documentary came as much of a surprise. If you've really been following, at the very least, I think like the past decade of Nickelodeon news or whispers or allegations that aren't really ever coming to the light. However, there's always been whispers. I think the most concrete evidence that we got up until this point was Jeanette McCurdy's book, I'm Glad My Mom Died, when she talks about a character that she doesn't name by name but is known as the creator, which is most likely believed to be a stand-in for Dan Schneider in this case. Uh, Basically, what I'm trying to say is there have been allegations, and none of this really comes as a surprise while watching this documentary. Uh, and I kind of just want to talk about some of the aspects of it. Some parts that I liked of the documentary, some that I didn't. And I want to get some of the dislikes out of the way. Investigation Discovery is the network that put this on. I had issues with the way that this documentary was filmed. The genre is kind of described as a true crime documentary, and I understand because it is technically a true crime. There are aspects of it where it leaves it on cliffhangers. There's really dramatic entrances. There's music. There's a lot of specific editing that goes into documentaries, specifically that we've seen in true crime documentary, more like true, like murder mystery documentaries that felt, I'm not going to say tone deaf exactly, but felt a little weird to see it. Like one of the ones that really stands out to my mind is where we learn of someone who was abused at the end of episode 2, and they're kind of going back and forth, and you're kind of like, oh, who's going to pop out? If you hadn't seen the trailers, you weren't really sure. You're just like, oh, who's this about to be? What's going to happen here, et cetera, et cetera. Like, oh, who is this? And everyone's kind of going back and forth. And then finally, out of the shadows steps Drake Bell, and he sits down, and it's basically cuts on him being like, all right, so we're going to talk about this for the first time. And then it cuts, and it's like, well, tune back next week. And there was a little bit of a reality TV feel in there that, again, I don't want to call exploitive. I did find a little distasteful. That's all what I'll say on that. And there's that element of reality TV in this documentary throughout. And again, it's not often, however, I did notice it, and there were scenes like that where I was just like, that's not handling it the most tactfully way. And I understand you want to build up hype for your next episode. You want to make sure people continue to watch. And obviously having Drake Bell, one of the probably most famous examples of uh, misconduct, abuse that happened at Nickelodeon, and hearing his story, it is key, and I understand why they wanted to tease it that the way they did and want to make sure that people heard that. There was something, like I said, I just found off-putting in the way that it is delivered in this documentary. I, this documentary, Quiet on Set, is really trying to get at the idea of the systemic abuse that was going on at Nickelodeon and how that all kind of started with Dan Schneider and his influence on the network and the people that he hired, and basically it becoming a boys club of misconduct, abuse, and child predators basically being free to run amok. That is, I think, the thesis of Quiet on Set. Does it land it? And that's where I'm having complicated feelings with. I don't know if it lands it. I believe everyone who comes forward in this documentary. I believe their stories. I've heard, at the very least, again, similar rumblings about this. Again, anyone who is connected even slightly in the industry, they've heard these rumors. Even if you're not connected into the industry, this is almost now just kind of become a widespread point of internet discussion that we're talking about for Quiet on Set. And thus, while watching it, I was really burdened with watching it with this idea of, will this documentary, Quiet on Set, The Dark Side of Kids TV, really the first time that the name Dan Schneider and misconduct allegations have been really cemented and broadcast to a large audience? Obviously, there's been a little bit of stories written about him. There's a few pieces. There's obviously the Jeanette McCurdy book. But this is, I feel like, the biggest chance that people have really gone to talk about Dan Schneider, the creator, and his alleged abuse on sets. And my thought process while watching this was, is this enough to break the system? Is this enough to ensure that it never happens again? Or is essentially this documentary successful at going after the system and enacting change? And that's an extremely unfair standard to put this documentary at. However, it is also kind of the case of, if you're the first one there to really get this story, you don't want to botch this story. And do I think they botched this documentary? No, I don't. But it also felt like there could have been more in this documentary. There could have been more, if not evidence, more connection, more, more, I guess, for a lack of a better word, I guess the word is evidence, but that's such a complicated term when we're talking about cases that have so much NDA. But basically, more patterns of a trend being set at Nickelodeon, and maybe finding more cases of this. And I guess it's the thing of, when you look at it, it's a little bit over 2.5 hours, I would say, is the entire runtime. And they're going after 20 years of history, and it's quite just literally not enough to really dive deep into it. And I think the Drake Bell part is the most commendable of watching it, because again, that's where we learn the most concrete evidence, because obviously this is a court case that went to court. The person was found guilty. Drake Bell came forward and said, this case that happened that people know about, that's me, that happened to me, and I'm now willing to talk about it on camera. Those parts are really fascinating to listen to, really upsetting to listen to, and I think also paint the best picture of what this documentary is trying to do. Other times, they don't have as clear cut of a case, I guess, if you will say. So they're going really based on the audience is being told, oh, this is what's happening, this is what's happening, this is what's happening. So that obviously means that, so that obviously means that, so that obviously means that. We're essentially being filled out like this is what's going on and this is how you have to understand it. And again, I believe that to all be true, but I don't know if it was enough to really prove a systemic issue at Nickelodeon, which again, I believe is there. But being so quick paced about it and trying to get through multiple ideas and discussion points in it hurts the documentary at the end where you're watching it and it's just like it didn't show enough to show the imprint that Dan Schneider had on the Nickelodeon channel. It showed enough concrete to make me fully believe everything and feel validated in what we had already believed in him. Like, I will say that, like, it is probably the most concrete aspects that we've learned about it. But is it enough that Nickelodeon will not be able to sweep this entirely under the rug and they're essentially allowed to go on with normal business and, for all we know, allowing this to kind of keep going on? That's where I'm a little worried about, where I'm just like, if this is the only attempt we get, was this enough to implement change? That's an impossible question to ask. That is one that will take years to actually learn and discover. So I kind of want to just stop with that thought, at least on my critical analysis, because that's not really real critical analysis. I'm fully aware of that. I'm placing my own projection, my own feelings onto a documentary that I don't know if it can be looked at in those standards fairly. While watching this, I will say the Drake Bell part, like I've already said, was the one that I found the most compelling for obviously horrifying reasons and for everything that's explored in there. And I'll also share this, and I'm going to be really careful with what I say here on this. I've seen some discussion online that has basically said, well, Drake Bell had this incident a few years ago that involved a minor. Like, why are we listening to him? Like, this is painting him to be some sort of like almost his comeback, and we're all accepting and showing love to someone who doesn't deserve this, essentially. And I've seen some of this criticism online, and I just want to say, as someone who at previous jobs years ago, as someone who has worked with survivors, who's someone who has also worked with people who have abused and have worked on the rehabilitation side of that and trying to enact positive change and all that. One of the things you learn really quickly is that abused people abuse people. And that's saying that in all the cases I think that I worked in years ago and going through that, the one common denominator always seemed to be that the person who abused someone was typically abused at a young age themselves. And it's this cyclical pattern of just nastiness and cruelty and life damaging things and events and disheartening, disturbing that isn't going away because it's just a cyclical nature. And the idea of rehabilitation is for someone to come to terms with not only what they did, the consequences of that, the damage that they caused, but also what made them act that way, what made them act out that way, what happened to them, and understanding the abuse that happened to them, the pain that they suffered, and then in part then the pain that they caused to others. And the reason I say this and share this experience is because it really reminded me of Drake Bell's story in episode 3, where you're seeing someone talk very openly and honestly about the sexual abuse that took place at a young age. And I don't believe this documentary to be trying to basically be a comeback vehicle for Drake Bell. I think how I approach this, and maybe this is the optimist in me, and a more cynical person will read this as he's an actor, he's trying to get back in the good graces of people after some really bad headlines after the past few years. The optimist in me chooses to believe this as this is someone who's coming to terms with what happened to him and what how that impacted him growing up, and how that essentially destroyed his ability to be a functional human being to some degree. And that's not absolving him of his crimes. That's not absolving him of the blame. That is him having to do that journey of discovery, of remorse, of genuine empathy to find healing and essentially end a pattern of abuse, stop it head on. Damage has already been done. He has already put damage onto another person, but in stopping it, in learning about it, in talking about it, you he I believe it to be a case of this is what happened, this is what happened to me, this is why I am who I am, and that's not absolving me, that's not excusing me of any of my behavior. Simply, I need to talk about this for one, the damage that it had to myself, to my family, to everyone who I've now affected in my adult life. And also, I'm saying this because no other person should have to endure this. And we need to openly talk about it. And again, I really want to make sure that this is emphasized. That is not absolving him of his wrongdoings and crimes. That is him taking the steps towards rehabilitation